Welcome to the Global Seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I am Shannon Marquez, Dean of Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so honored that you've joined us today for this first seminar in a global seminar series of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. Now, this fall, we're partnering with the Columbia Global Center in Istanbul for the series titled Rising from the Rubble, Post-Disaster Recovery and Resilience, which will be focused on the earthquake recovery and rebuilding in Turkey, and will be facilitated by the Columbia Global Resilience Fund. The program includes 3 global seminars open to the public, and today's global seminar focuses on building back better, multi-stakeholder, multi-risk, informed urban development approaches, where we will be exploring strategies for rebuilding urban areas post-disaster through a multi-stakeholder approach that integrates environmental, social, and economic risks into planning to foster resilient and sustainable communities. And we're so honored to have experts stepping into the collaboratory with us today who will share insights on collaborative urban risk management following the devastating 2023 earthquakes in Turkey. And now, before we begin this important discussion, and especially for those of you joining us for the very first time today, I want to provide a bit of background about the Global Columbia Collaboratory. The Columbia University Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement, in partnership with the Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects, launched the Global Columbia Collaboratory in May 2020 as a virtual exchange initiative to support students around the world. The collaboratory brings students, thought leaders, and educators together, promotes cross-cultural communication, and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. Students have participated from over 44 countries around the world and are drawn from all 3 undergraduate schools at Columbia, as well as visiting institutions. This semester, we have 34 students representing 17 universities around the world, and we have collaboratory students tuning in today from China, India, Ireland, Turkey, Italy, France, Pakistan, and the USA, just to name a few. Using smartphones and laptops to access the Collaboratory Virtual Exchange platform, students form a community of global thinkers and problem solvers through participation in themed global seminars featuring international speakers, such as our seminar today, as well as facilitated reflection, ideation, and collaboration activities. As learning and perspectives are shared across the collaboratory, students form project teams and collaborate to tackle specific global issues and topics related to the theme. And the collaboratory serves as an incubator for bringing ideas into reality and promoting new projects and innovative solutions for global challenges. We are thrilled that undergraduate students from all over the world have been actively engaged in the collaboratory every semester since it launched in 2020. And the program continues this fall with this very important focus on post-disaster recovery. And again, I want to welcome everyone to this Global Columbia Collaboratory seminar. And I want to thank all of our partners and esteemed panelists. We are so pleased to be working directly with Columbia Global Centers and many partners for these seminars. And at this time, I want to hand over to Marve from Columbia Global Center, Istanbul, who will give some introductory remarks and introduce our panelists today.
Thank you very much, Dean Marquez. Hello, I would like to say a warm welcome to everyone. I'm Merve İspahani. I'm the Academic Programs Manager at Columbia Global Centers, Istanbul. We are delighted to be presenting the first webinar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory on post-disaster recovery and resilience. Today, we will talk about a multi-stakeholder, multi-risk informed urban development approach with our distinguished speakers. This is a topic of urgent importance. Following the devastating earthquakes that hit Turkey and Syria in February 2023, we know that recovery work will continue for years to come. How can we integrate environmental, social, and economic risks into urban planning to foster resilient and sustainable communities? As our title suggests, how can we build back better as we are faced with an alarming increase in the complexity and frequency of global crises? Before we move on to our discussion, I would like to mention that after the earthquakes, the Columbia Global established a Global Resilience Fund to serve as a platform for Columbia University community to respond to major global crises in a coordinated way. The Global Resilience Fund is designed to harness the university's intellectual resources and expertise in partnership with local in-country institutions to support recovery and resilience efforts, and to enable research and scholarship that lead to increased understanding of the root causes of crises and development of novel, feasible, and scalable solutions. I would like to thank Dean Marquez and also Gail Lynch to address post-disaster recovery and resilience with this unique learning opportunity for students all around the world. I would also like to thank our panelists and our students who showed deep interest in this timely topic. Before further ado, please allow me to introduce our first speaker. Ebru Gencer is a researcher, scholar, and practitioner on urban risk, climate resilience, and sustainable development. She has a PhD in urban planning from Columbia University and is the founding director of the Center for Urban Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience in New York, and Adjunct Associate Professor of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University, and a Faculty Advisory Committee member of the Columbia Global Center in Istanbul. Previously, Dr. Gencer was the chair of the Urban Planning Advisory Group to the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Disaster Risk Reduction and a Senior Urban Resilience Advisor at the World Bank. Dr. Gencer has worked on disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and urban development and design projects in Southeastern Europe, Turkey, Latin America, and Caribbean regions, and is the author of several books and articles on urban risk, climate change, and sustainable development. So thank you very much. And Dr. Gencer, the floor is yours.
So I want to mention, as Mary mentioned, we are one of the award winners for the Columbia Global Resilience Fund project. So I want to start by explaining our project and what we do, what we plan to do, and give a little bit overview of a conceptual foundation of what it means to build back better for resilience, and some international lessons learned from Kobe earthquake, reconstruction after the Kobe earthquake. So let's look into the Columbia Global Resilience Fund project. It's titled Building Back Better in Hatay, co-designing a multi-stakeholder, multi-risk-informed urban development approach. And here is my team with me is Jackie Klopp. She's the director of the Center for Sustainable Urban Development, and Andrew Krakowicz. He's a senior research scientist at the Columbia Climate School. That's our project team, but of course we, as an important part of our project, as we want it to be very interdisciplinary and also very collaborative, we also hope and plan and hope to collaborate with several colleagues, some of whom are in this call, and other stakeholders in Turkey, local partners in Turkey and Hatay. So the team will enlarge as the time goes by. So what is the approach of our project? As I mentioned, we want it to be multi-hazard approach and multi-stakeholder approach. So why is it multi-hazard? Because it is given the current global risk context, which is dynamic, complex, and compounding, we think that it's necessary to move beyond just solely earthquake risk reduction in the region and take the opportunity to develop a multi-hazard approach. And why is it multi-stakeholder? Because we think that this will not only increase knowledge base and technical capacities, but it will also lead to the empowerment of communities and stakeholders who are rarely included in decision making. So a multi-hazard approach to risk reduction and reconstruction will also support the feasibility and inclusivity of planning actions. And another important point for our project is given the historical and cultural importance of Hatay province in Turkey, we would also like to give special importance to the multicultural context, including the heritage of the built environment and the social environment. So we have like three main project activities, or we envision three main project activities. So the first one is how can we build this approach that I mentioned about how can we look at reconstruction through this interdisciplinary collaborative process? How can we build that process? So that is the main part of our project. And while doing that, we'll also undertake analysis and studies, including impact-based climate forecasting, to support this approach. Our friends and our colleagues at the Climate School will undertake some climate studies to the extent of data availability. And also we plan to have an educational studio, which I'll be teaching in the spring semester at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture and Planning and Preservation. And we also aim to undertake workshops together with Columbia Global Center in Istanbul and our partners in Hatay to integrate this knowledge across disciplines to produce preliminary co-designed locally targeted principles and proposals. So this was a little bit of our project. And so what do we base the foundation of our project, and what do we base the foundation of Building Back Better? So I wanted to mention a little bit of the theory behind, and especially with some of the work I've done with the United Nations as we worked on developing this theory. So first of all, what is Building Back Better? Actually, there is international recognized definition of Building Back Better, but of course we can work on it. But it's by the United Nations, it is recognized that Building Back Better is the use of recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction phases after a disaster to increase the resilience of nations and communities through integrating disaster risk reduction measures into the restoration of physical infrastructure and societal systems, and into the revitalization of livelihoods, economies, and the environment. Actually, we would like to maybe go a little bit step further from this, because we believe that Building Back Better should have a transformative component to it. That is why you're not building back to the status quo, but you are building back better. So it should go into a transformative phase towards sustainable development and increasing, again, the livelihoods, the economies, and the overall system of the community. And here is also a little bit work we have done to support this theory. Basically, how do we understand risk? We think that we propose a more systemic understanding of risk and resilience, which includes different types of shocks and stresses, and consider the effect of environmental, socioeconomic, and political processes and trends. And it's again a work we did with UCLG, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and UN Habitat. And again, as you see, these stresses and shocks and systems, so that really covers the multi-hazard approach that we think about, because it's not just the shock, like an earthquake shock that we think about, but what are the economic stresses, like climate stresses, and try to understand the whole systems. And just illustrate a little bit further what I mean by Building Back Better approach, and this is again like something we worked on. The regular disaster risk management system would, as you see, be this ellipse that would go through disaster preparedness, shock, relief, recovery, reconstruction. And as you see, the cycle then would continue. the Building Back Better approach is trying to take the cycle, try to break the cycle, as you see in the reconstruction phase, and try to get out of the cycle so that the system, the community then becomes more resilient, and goes towards sustainable development. And that's what I mean by we want to have this transformative, there's building back, the concept of building back better has this transformative quality to it. It's not just reconstruction, but it goes a step further and wants to, again, have this transformation in society. And also to support this, I also wanted to show this. This is, again, a concept that we worked at the United Nations. How can we make what it means to be resilient, what it means to be a resilient city? And this is a project that we worked like about 2 years with multitude of like stakeholders, many cities and governments and other stakeholders involved, so that we could think about what are the main components to be able to make a city more resilient. And we have identified 10, what we call 10 essentials. First of all, we need to organize for resilience, and what it means to organize that includes the governance component, the multi-stakeholder governance component, but it also needs support of decision makers, for instance. It means coordination, it means coordination center. So I think that's like one really main important of trying to move forward. And again, like, risk assessments, financial capacity, urban development and design, nature-based solutions, strengthening both institutional capacities, but also societal capacities, infrastructure resilience, the disaster response, recovery and building back better. And I'll get to some of these components in the example of reconstruction of Kobe. So I just wanted to show a couple of slides about some learnings from Kobe. And this is this was an academic program. It was one of my classes. I was able to take some of my students to, our students focused on like doing a comparative study about the earthquake that happened in Istanbul, the 99 Marmara earthquakes and the Kobe earthquake, and the processes that evolved afterwards, both in two contexts and the comparative study. And at the end of the program, we were able to visit Kobe and other colleagues and learn 10 of their processes. So just very briefly, there was a major earthquake in Kobe. It was called the Great Hanshin earthquake. As you can see, the destruction, infrastructure, traditional neighborhoods, small traditional neighborhoods, unfortunately, burned down. It was because of the, the dwelling structures, and also the roads were too narrow to be able for the fire department to go into. So there was this major destruction that was like the biggest destructions that far in Japan, and caused an immense monetary damage, in addition to, of course, losses. So just very quickly, what happened afterwards? One thing that happens in Japan, and I know that one of my colleagues will also talk a little bit about Japan afterwards, is there's always learning after a disaster. And if you look at the disaster management system, there was a big, what's called the first epoch, like the first period after a typhoon. Then the second period was after this Hanshin YG earthquake, the Kobe earthquake in 1995, and of course in 2005, there was the 2011, I think, there was the Great East Japan and earthquake and tsunami. There's always some learning and what it means. The institutional structures change. There are regulatory reforms, including building codes, urban planning, and so forth. So the first thing they did after 1995 earthquake, one of the first things was the revisions in building codes to design standards to prevent soft story failures, improving material strength, detailing, requiring interim construction inspections for all new buildings, and requiring seismic evaluation and retrofits for all pre-1981 public. So the very first thing is, I think, this institutional structures and institutional and regulatory. An example of this changes for the soft story failures and so forth is this was the municipal building that, as you can see, the middle floors of the building had collapsed, and this is now like the base of the building where they are able to make the building be more resilient. So another important aspect of this reconstruction after this earthquake in Kobe was the vision, as I mentioned, the governance, the component of governance, because the mayor, just 9 days after the earthquake, he was able to have like a basic vision for reconstruction for the city. So I think that is a very important issue. They wanted to build back better, not just, as I mentioned, not just reconstruct Kobe as to what it was before, but they, with this vision, they really wanted to build back better, transform the city, and have an idea of like what type of a city they wanted to have in the future. They wanted Kobe to be safe. They wanted to attract both local and international finance and collaboration. They wanted the city to be vital, but they also believed in cooperation. And this cooperation, I don't mean just like with international organizations, other partners, but they also told that the multi-stakeholder component was really important for them. They wanted to involve communities into the planning process. So as part of this multi-stakeholder governance, they have developed this COVID disaster prevention welfare communities, what's called BOCOMI. And there are several BOCOMIs in Kobe, and all of these BOCOMIs, these communities, are in elementary school districts. And they were able to also include this collaboration within both the horizontal, the vertical governance system, basically formalize the way for the communities to include their wants, their needs, and their inputs into the decision-making process. For the urban planning of Kobe after the earthquake, they did a phase planning process. They started with infrastructure, ensuring, because as you have seen, the highways had collapsed and so forth. They started with this phase planning and infrastructure development, land readjustment as the first phase. And the second phase was more local parts, neighborhood districts, and so forth. An important aspect of this planning process was that it was participatory planning. And as you can see, communities working together in Japan. And here is like one of the neighborhoods that was, as I had mentioned, that had burned down because of the narrow, because of the narrow streets, the old timber houses, and the redevelopment process, together with the neighborhood, land gave itself to this. And here's, for instance, this Rokomichi Park, redevelopment afterwards. And here, for instance, as part of this redevelopment, they tried to widen the streets as much as for the fire brigade to be able to enter. So that was the idea. And as you can see in this middle of the street, there are these subdivision markers. The subdivision markers indicate, again, as this was land readjustment, indicate the amount of space both of the neighbors, house owners have. And they use innovative design for, again, this is from the park, Rokomichi Park. Why is this innovative? You can see this as a park bench, but if you open this up, there is a water there's a water reservoir under this bench. And why did they decide to make this water reservoir? Is for the neighborhood to be able to use it in case of fire, in case of a disaster. So again, like innovative design ideas, what we call it, co-beneficial design ideas. Again, co-beneficial design in the park, especially thinking about different hazards and also increasing the quality of life in the space. And then again, this is from Kobe, plan building back better. They build back better while also remembering the past and leaving this destruction, parts of destruction for the community to see and remember, and in a way kind of accept it as part of their history. So just a couple of points from this. So to build back better is understanding the complex and dynamic nature of risk is, I think, one of the key aspects of building back better, because it is not, again, for instance, in the context of Turkey, not building back for just earthquakes, but understanding different types of risk, different type of stresses and problems in the community. Decision makers, policy makers need to commit to making transformative changes. However, building back better requires multi-stakeholder participation in all stages of planning, and not just at the end for approval. And while there are these international lessons learned, just in the Kobe example, we also need to take into consideration that each context, such as in Hatay in Turkey, has different governance systems, different cultures, special contexts, technical and financial capacities. So we can't just, in a way, export these ideas, but we need to see how they could be fit for use in the context that we use it. Thank you.
Hello. So thank you very much. So let's move on to our second speaker, second panelist, Dr. Illya Azaroff. Illya Azaroff, Fellow of American Institute of Architects, is a renowned architect and a leader in disaster mitigation, resilient planning, and regenerative design. He's currently involved in significant projects such as the New York State Climate Impact Assessment and 2024 Hazard Mitigation Plan for New York City. His expertise extends globally, collaborating with various organizations. He leads a studio focusing on community resilience hubs in Hawaii, Dominica, and New York, as well as programs to enhance resilience in long-term care facilities in North Carolina. As a COP27 delegate for the American Institute of Architects, he is actively involved in international climate conferences and has led the COP28 delegation in Dubai in 2023. He is a tenured professor at CUNY, where he champions sustainability and resilience across the curriculum. Thank you very much.
That was really wonderful to hear the first presentation. It's really great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And as was mentioned, I'm Illya Azaroff. I'm an architect, educator, and geographer, and my work is dedicated to bringing greater voice and visibility to underserved communities, advancing adaptation, mitigation, and regeneration. My office has been doing work all over the world, and I'm committed to bringing more hands to this essential work. And that's why I love talking to students and colleagues about how to get involved in this work. And I don't have to tell all of you that we're all in the same storm. And we really need to understand the nature of the storm to be able to navigate it. So as was said, this is about all hazards. Enduring shocks and stresses from hurricanes and tornadoes to tropical storms, to flooding and drought, as well as addressing resource stresses that often follow a disaster, from earthquakes across the world, whether it was in Turkey or Nepal, with the loss of housing and infrastructure, the loss of community and livelihood, and noting that chronic events are increasingly more common, placing millions of more vulnerable people around the world at risk. We've agreed to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that's 350 million more vulnerable people around the world. So this is the storm that we're all in. Every minute of every day, 24 people are displaced around the world, from here in Istanbul to all across the world. Last year alone, we topped over 100 million people displaced for the very first time, including the numbers. Those numbers include the folks in Turkey. That was at a total cost of $236 billion just last year. So I was asked to reflect a little bit on the recovery after the 2023 earthquakes in Turkey. And there's a great deal of work, there's a great deal of good that is going on, creating temporary shelter for people, and really trying to bring cities back very rapidly. But sometimes rapidly really gives us some serious issues later on. This is the first disconnect in understanding two serious things, and some of those were alluded to in the first speaker's information. We need to recognize the difference between Band-Aids and major surgery. This work needs to understand the difference, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the second issue is healing versus curing. I consider this the most critical difference in success and failure in post-disaster. Healing is focused on resolving the cause of the problems, while curing is managing or resolving the symptoms. How do we build a better future if we are only focused on curing, replacing a house or replacing a bridge? Much is the same way they were before. That's the reason we're talking about building back better. And when we act following a disaster, we must be prepared to meet all of the 7 community lifelines to maintain true community. Safety and shelter, food, water, shelter. We have to really look at medical and health, energy, communication, transportation, and hazardous materials to look at it holistically. Because when we plan and rebuild, we need to build resilient communities that can adapt and thrive into the future, go beyond where they were before. There's a reason that they failed based on shocks and stresses. So how do we prepare the next city to be much more resilient? Any urban planning and recovery must be holistic. It must have a holistic approach that cross-cuts all the sectors as well as the SDGs. These are the SDGs that Turkey has committed to. And I don't see this happening to a high degree today in Turkey. Civil society is not being truly leveraged to create new solutions. The Sustainable Development Goals are this global call to action. And this is the opportunity that we must address those as well as building back better. And to really give you an example, Japan comes to mind, and it's a different example than it was shown before, because all phases of preparedness and recovery, a complete understanding of when major surgery is needed and when healing versus curing is necessary. The Japanese are very much prepared following Kobe to respond to all 7 community lifelines when a disaster occurs, not just housing, but they have prepared temporary bus stops, temporary bus routes, temporary markets, temporary hotels, information centers, bathhouses, community centers, all of the pre-planned areas for location of these elements using baseball fields, parking lots, and other elements. So this pre-planning and an understanding of how we continue as a community is the rationale that the Japanese have adopted. And when displacement and relocation occurs, the people and families are displaced together. And what I mean by that, if you are displaced in your neighborhood, you're asked to list the 10 families nearest you when you go to the displacement center. So they quickly organize to displace all families from the similar neighborhoods, maintaining social structures, friendships, and support. I mean, can you imagine that my child's babysitter was displaced with us, right? Think about that. That is part of moving towards healing and an understanding of social systems. And real surgery is to rethink cities and towns, not to repeat the mistakes of the past and address the issues of the future is where we're going. And Onagawa, a very small town, is one of the many examples. Replanning entire cities and towns and relocating them for the future, for future life safety, while maintaining history, culture, and social resilience is really extraordinary following the Tohoku disaster. So here's just a brief timeline. For Onagawa, a complete reshaping of the surrounding mountains was needed to relocate all housing up and out of tsunami zones for the future city. And they also took the tops of those mountains and infilled the former town center to elevate the area to create a new commercial zone with layers of resilience and infrastructure that are much more risk adverse to future earthquakes and tsunamis. In fact, underneath the entire base plane of the town, they put isolators through the entire town. So the entire town will move with earthquakes without taking major damage. So that's a brief example of what I mean by major surgery with some of the social context. But to highlight that even more, it's not just the major surgery, it's the healing aspect. So here's an example of the Ibasho Cafe. So noting after the Great Tohoku disaster, an entire region of Japan being completely devastated and destroyed, the Ibasho Cafe is a not-for-profit organization that went in and set up tea houses. A tea house is the center of society in small Japanese villages. It's where everyone would come to exchange information as well as come together and find lost relatives, whatever it may be. It became a social hub. The social hub also became the meeting place. So elders organized 330 events and welcomed more than 11,000 visitors to the Ibasho cafes, integrating activities with local schools, temporary housing communities. They became the community activist site. So think about that. But it's also rooted in a cultural context that is really necessary for everyone to recognize it, adopt it, and make it their own. And it's not just there, but the Ibasho Cafe has now gone worldwide. This is a shot after the earthquakes in Nepal, that the equivalent of Ibasho Cafe is organized that really uses the cultural context. So when you think about an urban planning and recovery, how do you bring these lifelines and leverage community is what we're talking about. So now, since you are looking at how to design or move forward, I'm going to ask you who to put on your team, right? Given the framework and example I just gave you of major surgery and healing, you may need to ask, well, what kind of team members do I have? Well, do I have architects, engineers, planners? Yes. But who you really need are historians, geographers, marine biologists, natural native trades, builders, anthropologists, community leaders. Ideally and essentially, multi-sector engagement is key. Everyone has a role, everyone. Community needs to be on your team, young and old, to ensure that there's a future to hold the younger people in those new communities through training and economic opportunities. So don't count them out. In fact, count them in. They will see the recovery through to that bright future, right? Local artisans and skilled laborers, as I mentioned, part of your team to bring cultural practice and skills, but also to maintain a sense of place and historic context. This is Tuoni, someone who I work with. He's part of my design teams in the Pacific. He's one of the master carvers, and he's starting a carving school inside of our projects in some of the buildings we're creating, noting that there are no jobs for younger people, and this is a dying art. And so this is part of the resuscitation and regeneration that's taking place. Also seek out inspirational leaders, even if they're not from where you are doing the work. Inspirational leaders, learning from their practices and examples. This is on the right is Mama Maria. She activated and 10,000 women farmers in Papua New Guinea using regenerative practices and changing the way that they grew food, elevated 10,000 families out of poverty. That's incredible. And how she did the social organization to do that, the education to do that, and the export of that. You can learn from everyone everywhere to bring that to your context. It's a different context, as was stated in the first presentation, but you can learn from these great leaders in the how to do it. And did I say community? Yes, I'm going to say community one more time because that's what's missing in a lot of what's happening in Turkey. The most satisfying part about expanding your design team with community is that you expand your family and knowledge of indigenous wisdom, of local people who understand place better than you ever could. And they bring that project, you're mining out the resilient solutions that already exist within the community, empowering them to do the work that's necessary to go forward. All disasters are local, all responses are local. So think about that. So that brings me to a very similar slide that we'd seen closing the last presentation. We should all adopt this ethos from the Japanese. They always asked, when I would ask them, how are you going to pay for all of this work? They said, no, wait, no. What is the value of one human life? It's not about the cost of the work. When we make decisions and planning for the future of our communities, we should be asking that. What is the value of one human life? So with that, I'm going to say thank you.
Thank you very much, Illya. And now we will move to Ali Höcek, our third speaker. Ali Höcek is the principal of New York-based AC Höcek Architecture and an adjunct professor at the Spitzer School of Architecture at the City College of New York. He co-founded CARRRE and has been actively involved in consulting efforts in Turkey's 2023 earthquake-hit regions, collaborating with municipalities, professionals, academics, NGOs, and local residents. As a board member of a medical group, Höcek participates in annual clinics in Central America, leading to his Tropics housing proposal, which emphasizes prefabrication and community-driven construction. His resilience work includes a community restaurant and teaching kitchen in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which also received Saran National Design Award, and an educational pavilion on healthy foods and architecture planned for a public park in Brooklyn, also received a Saran National Design Award. Ali, thank you very much.
Thank you, Merve, for inviting me and for that introduction. So within a few months of the February 2023 earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, a group of us formed CARRRE, as Merve mentioned, Collective Action for Readiness, Recovery, and Resilience. CARRRE is composed of architects and other concerned professionals with the goal of giving agency to those on the ground. Although our initial impulse as creative professionals was to start designing and building we took a different approach by first listening to experts and those working in the affected region. To facilitate this, we organized a series of panel discussions in New York and Istanbul. The panels featured experts in architecture, engineering, and urban planning, including the speakers you just heard. In January of this year, almost a year after the earthquakes, my partner and I traveled to the region and met with 3 municipalities, cooperative groups, academics, and small design firms active in the area. Our intent was not only to listen again to the needs of their communities and observe their efforts, but also to share some of our concepts for recovery and preparedness. The panel discussions and our visit to Turkey presented a breadth of scientific and empirical knowledge. As a professor of architecture and a professional, what informed our work that followed can be summarized in 3 points. First, resilience and recovery must be a comprehensive approach that addresses the various systemic factors contributing to vulnerability. These include not only social and built environments, but also a city's infrastructure, economy, and governance. Second, as TOKİ, the Turkish government housing agency, rushed to erect temporary settlements and attempts to build public housing at a massive scale, it created a second disaster. These container settlements and apartment blocks lacked the public spaces needed for communities to heal, recover, and prepare for future crises. The left photo shows a camp in Jordan, and the bottom right is of a settlement in Turkey, both using the same planning approach of repeating units and centralized public facilities. The rendering of permanent TOKİ housing on the top right adds little difference to these. Third, while resilience and recovery efforts are partly funded from the top down, a significant portion of the work is driven from the bottom up by municipal initiatives, community groups, informal collectives, NGOs, and individuals. Shown here is some of the work done by the people we've met and continue to engage with, offering innovative and creative solutions as alternatives to prevailing practices. During our visit to Turkey, we shared resilience concepts from both contemporary and historic efforts in Japan, many of which you've just heard. Concepts which my colleague from CARRRE, Dana Welkavage, and I are developing as urban resilience parks and networks. A key precedent from Japan is the hyokechi, large open spaces in historic Tokyo that acted as fire breaks. After fires destroyed homes, the land was appropriated and owners were given property elsewhere in the city, as shown in the map on the right. In normal times, these spaces served as parade grounds and social gathering areas, reverting to fire breaks in emergencies. With Donna, I will present in more detail our work on urban resilience parks and networks to the American Society of Landscape Architects next month in DC. Contemporary Japanese disaster prevention parks function in a similar manner to the hyokechi. They offer leisure activities in normal times while also delivering information and preparedness training. In a disaster, they serve as emergency facilities, converting manhole covers to toilets, benches to cooking grills, as Ebru has shown, and park pavilions to shelters. Integrated into their design are additional features that serve in the event of an emergency. These include white oak trees to act as fire breaks, paved pedestrian paths capable of supporting heavy vehicles, and surfaces suitable for helicopter landings. As we have conceived it, playing fields and cafes may be designed to convert into spaces of food distribution, emergency shelters, or medical facilities. In Turkey, a progressive municipality in Adana Seyhan was able to provide support badly impacted neighboring cities. Among them is a city-supported women's collective. This group of women, many of whom are Syrian refugees, recognized that women in the affected regions were without essential personal items. They sewed undergarments, fabricated sanitary napkins, and delivered these along with other necessities to women in temporary settlements, effectively addressing a critical gap in the supply of donated personal items. In a similar vein to the convertibility of the Japanese parks, the Adana Seihan municipality set up a greenhouse park about 20 minutes south of the city. The project was developed together with Ülge Uğurlu of the Dutch Collective of Municipalities, VNG International. The greenhouses are used to grow plants unique to the area, which are sold in the city. During a disaster, however, the greenhouse structures are quickly modified and converted to shelters for families. My students expanded on the greenhouse park concept by proposing a fragrance park where flowers would be cultivated for essential oils. These oils would then be refined into soaps and perfumes to be distributed and sold by the local women's collective. Like those seen on the right, profits would go towards the support of park maintenance. In times of crisis, the greenhouses would serve as a refuge, while the production facility could offer temporary jobs. This project highlights the importance of creating networks that leverage existing resources and consider the financial needs holistically. When we met with the deputy mayor of Osmaniye, a city heavily damaged by the earthquakes, she immediately recognized the benefits of an urban resilience park as part of a network of facilities and proposed a site that might be used in this way. The site shown here consists of two lots, one a quarter-round popular park with residents, and the other a rectangular lot currently used for parking. They are located near a school, hospital, cafe, and museum, making them ideal for creating supporting networks. Also considered part of this network is an open plaza to the north of the park, which the city had temporarily used to house displaced families after the earthquakes. Although the temporary settlement has been removed, in an event, the city would again use the plaza in a similar capacity. The student proposal for the site demonstrates how, if shelters were set up again in the adjacent plaza, refugees could receive critical information from kiosks in the park and connect with one another under the shade of a large canopy. The existing tea house could also serve this purpose and be used for food distribution, unlike the Yabasho cafe that Illya just showed us. During normal times, kiosks in the park would be managed by the hospital to offer public training in basic medical skills like CPR or setting broken bones. In emergencies, the kiosks may be appropriated by hospital staff to handle overflow and minor injuries and disseminate urgent care information and supplies. A workshop building is also proposed where high school students can learn basic skills in plumbing and woodworking. In a crisis when skilled labor is lacking, these workshops would support recovery efforts by providing repair services, clothing, and food distribution. Classes can also be extended to the community, taught by local professionals and retirees, further activating interactions among different groups within the city. By activating the park in these ways during normal times, it becomes a recognized destination associated with resilience. As a result, the Urban Resilience Park will naturally attract community members during a crisis, enabling quicker access to information and recovery efforts. In this final part, I will show you several ongoing design efforts by students, small design offices, and collectives conducting community workshops and building in the region, along with similar work from my own firm. The common focus in all of these efforts is building social capital in recovery. Seen here are works by Herkes için Mimarlık, or Architecture for Everyone, a collective of creatives, designers, and architects that has built many structures in struggling communities in Turkey. Following the earthquakes, they designed and built playgrounds, children's libraries, community centers, and other facilities aimed at fostering interaction, healing, and community planning. Their current aim is to solve the damage done to the social fabric following the earthquakes through architecture using simple methods and techniques. Responding to the need for public spaces for healing, education, music, and crafts, UVA, a group of architects and filmmakers, worked together to create a wooden panelized system immediately after the earthquakes. The system uses the efficiencies learned by set building in the film industry. UVA has since set up shops for local fabrication and continues to build in the region, addressing both social and economic vulnerabilities. Urban Co-op, an urban design firm in Istanbul, addressed the social challenges of the temporary container settlements I presented earlier. They reimagined the layout of container units to create a space for natural and social interventions. The diagrams shown here, created by my students and Urban Co-op, illustrate possible reconfigurations of repeating units commonly seen in temporary settlements, grouping them into clusters. These clusters form neighborhoods where social activities can occur, such as parks, vegetable gardens, chicken coops, communal ovens, and other culturally shared functions. In their proposal, a green corridor meanders through neighborhoods, bridging social interactions among them. Shared programs that, rather than being isolated to one area, are now distributed throughout the settlement. Each function brings further identity to the neighborhood, and each community garden brings in the potential of growing foods, rainwater collection, passive cooling, and other ameliorations. We are currently coordinating with Urban Coop to present guidelines around urban resilience networks to municipalities in a proposed 2025 conference in Turkey. Designed by my firm for a struggling neighborhood in Brooklyn, the Brownsville Community Culinary Center illustrates programmatic adaptability in times of crisis. Created to offer culinary arts training to young residents, it includes a teaching kitchen, restaurant, bakery, and community center, as seen in the top row. During the pandemic, Chef Rodney transformed the center to create thousands of meals to residents isolated in a food desert, before returning it to its original community culinary mission. This last project, Deploy, is also by my firm. The patent-pending design uses container-sized units and an inflatable roof to quickly assemble a structure that can be used in a variety of locations to prepare a community before an event, as a facility for community recovery programs, or to provide space for informal social interactions. In conclusion, CARRRE and the various projects we've discussed today highlight the power of collective action and the importance of designing for resilience in both everyday life and during crises. By listening to local needs, leveraging existing resources, and fostering networks that empower communities through social capital, we can create solutions that go beyond short-term or simply reactive fixes. These efforts, from urban resilience parks and networks to community-driven workshops and adaptable spaces, demonstrate how strategic design can strengthen the social fabric, support recovery, and enhance preparedness for future challenges. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for all three great presentations, all very insightful. So we will move on to the Q&A, but just to maybe open it up to the discussion. So Ebru, you mentioned about the transformative nature of rebuilding and how we should break the cycle in the reconstruction phase so that we can build better. And Illya, you mentioned about that you showed us such illuminating examples from Onovaga, where entire towns were moved and communities, so that the communities were kept together, and also the importance of multi-sector reconstruction efforts and how communities should actually be part of these efforts. And Ali, you highlighted the importance of such comprehensive approaches to recovery and resilience, and in contrast to the rushed public housing efforts, projects in Turkey and earthquake-hit regions in Turkey, which in fact led to a second disaster, as you mentioned. So apparently there is so much to learn from all these examples, and there is no one fit for all recipe for healing, Illya, if I would use your terminology. But I would like to ask all of you, could you please reflect on what are the peculiarities of the case of Turkey, this particular disaster? So what are the main challenges that we're faced with in terms of cooperation between different sectors, public and private, or others? So it would be great if, because I know that you've been familiar, you have visited the earthquake regions before. So could you please reflect on these particular challenges in the context of this broader framework? Thank you.
Sure. So I was deployed by the State Department to Turkey very soon after the disaster. I'm very involved with NGOs across the world, and the VOAD is volunteer organizations after disasters. There was a great many of those organizations that wanted to get involved in the initial recovery efforts, but the infrastructure, the central government infrastructure was not set up in a way to handle the requests of volunteer organizations coming in and setting up in Turkey. That hampered the entirety of where you're at today. There's a lot of great volunteer organizations that have not come in because of that initial difficulty, and now they have put their resources in other places of need, and that is an unfortunate crippling effect. It's sitting in the meetings to have the desire around the table of people talking about what we're talking about. While I was throughout the cities in southern Turkey, was just amazing to hear. Yet the capacity to do so, there's no formal infrastructure or formal way of doing that through ACOM or any place else. In a lot of other countries, you have a seat at the table if you are a registered NGO or part of a different sector, and that's in formation. It's just not quite robust. So when a major disaster hits, you can't bring the force of society to bear on recovery if they're not at the table to begin with. And so I think there's a bit of a catching up that's going on, a restructuring going on in Turkey. So this will be lessened the effect in next disaster. So that's what I can give you as far as that insight. There's a lot of detail to that, but that's the unfortunate thing. And when that doesn't happen, then banking and finance doesn't follow quickly either. There's fewer avenues for banking and finance from outside sources of recovery to set up. So that's the unfortunate thing. Ali, what's your experience?
Thank you. I mean, I can respond more from an empirical perspective. I mean, you sense when you're down there is or in Hatay region, you sense that there is a kind of top-down autocratic government, if I can say so. And what we experienced, for example, is we went with a friend to visit some of his family's properties and the home where he grew up in Kırıkhan. And he's an architect, and he assessed the building. He said, look, there's a crack in the column, but it's not a structural damage. This can be repaired. And yet it seems like the mandate is bulldoze everything down, and huge swaths of land are just removed. And you're taking with that economic infrastructure, you're taking away social interaction, you're destroying families because they're being placed into either temporary settlements, which are staying a very, very long time, not temporary at all, or going to Turkey. And the way they are distributed, often families are being broken apart. In the emergency, people were being delegated to settlements based on their physical condition. So if they were injured, they were given priority. I mean, the intention is good, but what happens then is the family, somebody's injured, they go to one place, somebody's not injured, they go to another. You've broken up the family. It is the family. It is these structures that hold and provide recovery. So the kind of top down is problematic. When we went to, we visited 3 municipalities, Adana Seyhan, Osmaniye, and Kahramanmaraş, each with its own political party, at least at the time, yeah, each with its own political party. But what we found was they were just hungry to, like, how can we better our situation? How can we build back better? They were all asking that question. They weren't looking at political agenda. Fortunately, from the top down, it's a very strong political agenda. From the bottom up, as I mentioned, we saw a lot of groups. Herkes Mimarlık comes to mind, Architecture Recovery Team in Delft, at Delft University in Holland, come to mind. You know, they're currently constructing things, and they're doing GoFund, you know, whatever, you know, GoFund to collect money. And if you want to donate, let me know, and I'll guide you to them. But you know, that's that. You know, so I think it's a multiple approach, and that's very important. And if it's autocratic, it's not going to be a multiple approach.
So one last thing I would say is speed. There is, and this happens in every disaster, and I think Ebru brought this up in her presentation, but you know, there's a desire to go ahead and replace and just go at speed because of the need. And any government is trying to provide a place of housing, temporary then permanent, skipping the steps that we all mentioned in our presentations today. And that was so evident that you had temporary villages set up that didn't have playgrounds, didn't have daycare, didn't have proper wash facilities. They were just boxes. We toured several of the ones that were set up with the UN direction, and they had all of those things as absolute minimums because the 7 community lifelines are absolute. But most of them, probably 9 out of 10, did not have those basic needs. Now, in Japan, with a heavily resourced country, heavily prepared to respond to disasters in a way that far outstrips many countries, including Turkey, the speed of their recovery still is decades. So you have to look at not having society live in those circumstances for decades. It erodes society to a point that you did not want to see. So that's what that speed, it's unavoidable that you're at it, but because of the construct that Ali had mentioned, and I've mentioned, that should be your moment of change, is that construct to get out of the current situation, almost like an intermediate step, very rapidly. Thanks.
This is also one of our students' questions, that, you know, what are the particular challenges when working with vulnerable, marginalized communities after disasters?
Let me pick that up, and I also just want to follow up on what Ali and Illya just mentioned. What I understand is, again, like the presentations we made, both Illya and I and Ali, we have seen, for instance, in the example from Kobe to the final earthquake, there was all of this preparation that's like within 20 years time. All the preparations had happened, institutional structures had changed, volunteer organizations were formalized into the decision making and planning processes. Unfortunately, we had that period from about the same time, from the 99 Marmara earthquakes that happened in Turkey. There were some developments, but unfortunately, it seems from what I hear, both from Ali and Illya, that again, still like this, the volunteer organizations have not been formalized into the system. Institutional structures were not set up in a way to receive the, both volunteer organizations and the funding processes, but also for planning and pre-disaster planning. I think this is a very important component. And, for instance, if there is a disaster that happens, what type of, where could be potentially resettlement areas? What do the cities need to purchase land? And do we have like adequate technical capacity to be able to, for instance, for building construction permit and so forth. So there is a lot to be done for pre-disaster planning. But just going into your question, back to your question, Merve, working with what are the considerations for the most disadvantaged or the most vulnerable communities. I think Ali and Illya again gave very good examples about, especially about the issue of relocation, because it is not just moving the families into temporary housing or long-term housing, but what are the considerations for these families in terms of where will they go to work, what are work, education components, social kin, and so forth, for the communities to increase their social resilience, their social capacities. That is also a very important view, as all my colleagues have mentioned, a very important part of the reconstruction process. For instance, in the example of also going back to like Japan, after the Tohoku earthquake in 2011, there was a point that temporary residences were made, and unfortunately, a lot of elderly populations were moved into these temporary shelters, but being separated from their friends and there was an increase in suicidal rates in the elderly populations. Yep. And that the reason was the psychological reason of like being separated from these social groups. So this is again, just to sum up, as both my colleagues mentioned, it's not just the physical reconstruction, but bringing the vulnerable groups in a way, or the most disadvantaged groups in a way, to increase both their social resilience, economic resilience, finding ways to provide livelihoods, increase education, awareness, training capacities, like Ali had mentioned with the workshops, so that they could add to their, again, livelihoods further on. So I think this is, again, a very complex system-based, should be a very complex system-based approach, and thinking about all of these components, which is, of course, very hard, but it requires some innovation, it requires some thinking, and well, I'll leave it there, but maybe my friends may adapt to that.
For vulnerable populations, I think what you just described, Ebru, is the healing process. But I do want to put a finer point on, when I said all disasters are local, all responses are local. That is absolutely true. So the most vulnerable populations often are the quickest affected and most often affected. However, they are the greatest source for understanding. They already know what their major problems are, their underlying chronic issues, their problems of 30 and 40 years. And you as an outsider, to engage in that, need to ask the question, to record it, and then do the very next thing, which is to say, Have you thought about the solutions? Because I will guarantee you that those communities already know the solutions. Your job to harvest that and help unlock the potential of and empowering people who are already powerful is elevating a community at risk to that moment of healing. And our experience in the Pacific, in small island communities that experience this, they already know what a resilient, sustainable, equitable future looks like. They know what it is. To get them to a point and support them in that effort to unlock NGOs, unlock those things that you can bring to the table is pretty extraordinary. So I just wanted to put a finer point on that go back to that point, is that they are your collaborative team and your most essential piece for doing that. And if you recognize that, then you'll also recognize you're always a guest in those locations, always. And if you are respectful of that, you will get to where you need to go with those groups, and they will impress you, and they will humble you too. Thanks.
I was just saying, how can I follow these great speakers? I think they, I think they covered the question.
But it's great because you also mentioned about, how the public sector, there's need, because what we have seen after the earthquakes in Turkey, that we have seen all the civil society organizations coming up together, like the examples that you showed us, for such innovative solutions for rebuilding. But for long-term rebuilding and reconstruction efforts, as Ebru, you mentioned, in a transformative sense, so these sectors should be connected, right, with the government or with the municipalities. So there should be, the particular challenges where all these expertise, the knowledge, scholarly knowledge, or practical expertise should also be connected or, heard by governments, right, public agencies.
No, I mean, the point I think was made of, multi-stakeholder participation,
Yes.
essential. I just wanted to mention that, but some of the work I showed, they were wood construction. I'm giving this as an example. They were wood construction, and from a U.S. point of view, from a European point of view, to see wood construction, we think that's easy. That's Home Depot. That's do it yourself. But actually, in Turkey, there is now, I mean, historically, there was, of course, wood construction. There's very little wood construction. And, we know it's renewable. We know the benefits of it. Yet concrete is the dominant construction material. And, that kind of goes back to my point, is that, I'm not saying that top-down or large government presence is necessary, but at the same time, what it has done, it has favored the construction industry among a small covey of contractors, and that has put people who are working from the bottom up and at the municipal level at a disadvantage. That it's now in the culture that people think concrete is the most stable construction you can build, So there's a kind of poison in the water as well that we have to realize. And with these projects that I've shown and many others that I haven't shown, a lot of this is a kind of, if you will, a kind of critique in a way, a critique of that we're not reading necessarily because we're seeing a wooden building, but it's in there. It's in there, and it's saying that, for example, the wood industry really needs to be given far more importance in Turkey, perhaps throughout the world, as we're seeing in Europe and the United States. I don't know if that's germane to the question that was originally asked and we're responding to, but if I'm contributing here, I would say that's significant in the work that we've seen. Yeah.
I just want to add to what Ali mentioned, and also Illya had shown in his presentation about involving the craftsmen in Tonga, which was really very meaningful for me too, because and that is like part of the exploration we would like to do in terms of how to include these how to focus on culture heritage. And I don't mean by culture heritage, it is, the traditional building material, the traditional knowledge that is part of the culture heritage, and how can we find that and incorporate that. And going to what Ali just mentioned, whether the, in a way, like different materials and different forms of construction being penalized. Indeed, like if we look at building codes in like across the world, in some countries, indeed it is penalized to use traditional materials in construction, because indeed concrete is thought to be a symbol of modernity. But how can we, in a way, like, but I think it is like, how can we, in a way, kind of use these old traditional materials, but also support them to be more resilient, or support them to be more, in a way, scaled up for construction? I think these are very important questions, and that we should all include in our research and in our explorations. Try to advocate for them.
Thank you, Ebru. We are running actually kind of out of time. So I think it will be we can conclude, but just to make sure, if you have any other concluding remarks in the sense of wrapping this up.
I'd like to. Oh, go ahead.
Please.
There was one amazing thing that I learned about the amazing cities and people in southern Turkey when I was there. I was touring one of the schools that took a lot of the displaced children, and the principal, we sat down and I was asking him how he can absorb so many new children into the school, and he said, an incredible storyteller and historian. He just said, well, let me tell you that this is historically where the birthplace of where the mosaic comes from, because this is where we've had 7 earthquakes in history that have destroyed everything. And we have to use all of the pieces to put it back into place and make it even more beautiful than it was before. And he was talking about that, about the children. And to me, what Ebru just said about all of these incredible artisans and the people of southern Turkey, and you have incredible building effort going on, it seems to me that activating local populations for the skill sets that they have to take part in their own recovery to create circular economy is exactly what the UN is trying to get all of us to do for disaster risk reduction. And it's exactly the moment that you have all of the material, the history, the culture, and the knowledge, and the people ready to do that. What is the mechanism and system to make that happen? Would be my closing thoughts and comments, because that would speed up recovery in a most astounding way, and make it such a place-based something the world has never seen. It would be the new mosaic of southern Turkey.
This is very powerful. Thank you very much to all our speakers for such an insightful discussion. Maybe at this point, I should leave it to Dean Marquez.
Thank you, Merve. Well, we have had an engaging discussion on the post-disaster recovery and resilience, looking at models from around the world. And this was the first seminar in the Global Columbia Collaboratory series of seminars focused on exploring strategy for rebuilding urban areas post-disaster through multi-stakeholder approaches that integrate environmental, social, and economic risks into planning to foster resilience and sustainability. And of course, we're using a virtual exchange platform that brings Columbia students, thought leaders, and educators from around the globe together to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make an impact. We are looking forward to the next Global Columbia Collaboratory seminars, which will be offered this semester. So please keep an eye out for the registration announcements for seminar number 2 and seminar number 3. Global Seminar number 2 will focus on assessing and addressing the health needs of vulnerable communities post-disaster. And Global Seminar number 3 will be on risk mitigation and long-term recovery, fostering coordination across sectors. Thank you again to our esteemed panelists who joined us today and to our amazing moderator. Many thanks to the team at Columbia Global Centers Istanbul, Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, we want to extend a very special thank you to our collaboratory students, partners, and participants from around the globe.